to those in the room, and good morning to those joining us on our live stream. Thanks for being here this morning. We have a second session with Cameron Howard, who is professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary. Before we get into that session, I just want to remind you all that this is actually our last adult ed session of 2021. Next week is Festival Sunday, which is the big Christmas celebration, and services are at 9 and 11 for that week. So think about that as you're getting ready to come in. Everything is shifted a little bit forward that morning. And then in January, starting on the 9th, it's been the tradition of Adult Ed to host the All Church Book Read. This year's book is Louise Erdrich's The Night Watchman. And so hopefully that gives you time to purchase and read that book and then participate in our All Church Book Read, which will be 3 of the weeks in January. We'll also have in January a special joint forum for MLK Junior holidays. So that's a little bit of info looking ahead. Hope that you will join us for that. Thanks for being here again, Cameron. We're excited to learn from you, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much. It's great to be with you again and to talk a little bit about why the Old Testament might actually be helpful for some of the difficult discussions and problems that we face in the world today. So I'm going to share my screen here. Here we are. So we're talking about having faith in tumultuous times, and specifically how the Old Testament might be a resource for us in that kind of work. And so the thesis I've been working with last week and this week is that the Bible provides both possibilities and hope for working across difference, not only because of what it says, but also by the way it came together. So in other words, we can learn from the Bible by reading things that it might tell us to do and then doing those things. But I think more than that, that simply the way that the Bible holds together multiple voices who had different ideas about what it meant to live faithfully under God amid times of change, that in and of itself is its own kind of resource for us to understand as we work across difference or to lead change, that the Bible, and I'm specifically focusing on the Old Testament here, the Bible contains texts from many different times, so times of great social and political, cultural and religious upheaval in the history of ancient Israel, as well as differing voices from the same time that came up with different ideas about how to live faithfully together. So this is one of the things that I love about the Old Testament. So I hope that in the next hour, I can help a little bit of that excitement be contagious. But we're going to look at some of the dustier corners of the Old Testament, some places that we might not open up and read as often. But first, just a little review of last week. So I proposed that there are 3 biblical modes of innovation. That is, there are 3 places where I would say, or ways that I see the Old Testament showing difference or diversity and newness, rethinking old ideas. And so the one that we focused on last week was adapting popular culture, that the Jewish court stories, of which Daniel 1-6 are an example, the Book of Esther, or the Joseph cycle in Genesis 37-50, is part of an existing genre in the ancient Near East, such as is exemplified by the story of Ahikar, which is an Aramaic story that was circulated widely, and that this kind of these tropes, this theme, this kind of story was adapted to talk about how Jews living in diaspora might both survive and then thrive with a particular identity in a foreign land. Today, I want to talk about two other ways that the Bible shows innovation within itself. And the first is a very sort of fundamental idea that it rethinks theological assumptions. We don't have just one idea, one theological idea in the Old Testament. We don't just have unanimity over what it meant to live under God in the Old Testament. And a really prime example of that is in the book of Ezekiel. And the prophet Ezekiel reconsiders, where is God? Where does God live? Where is God to be found? And then finally, developing a new genre. So the apocalypse as a genre of literature, a way of storytelling, which we find in the Old Testament in Daniel 7 through 12, but also, of course, in the New Testament book of Revelation. This is a wholly new way of storytelling that comes into view in the Second Temple period. And why then, and what was its purpose? That it's a totally new way of telling stories. So we're going to look at that as a way that the Bible, again, like reinvents old ideas. Now, last week, at the very end, there was an excellent question. We were looking at Daniel 1 and how Daniel and his friends refused to eat the food that the Babylonian king provides for them, even though they're situated there in the Babylonian court, having been brought there against their will, right, in exile, deportation. They're given Babylonian names and they're made to learn the Babylonian language and study Babylonian literature, and then meant to eat the Babylonian food. And they decide that that is a place that they cannot go. That is a line that they will not cross. And so the question from Ken was about how Daniel takes on the burden, sort of proving that they will thrive without the king's food, the burden of proof, because of course, Daniel's jailer there is afraid that if Daniel and his friends waste away, right, the king's going to be mad at the jailer. You have these layers of power and authority that are at work. And the question was about how we can shift the burden of hearing others' stories onto ourselves. What does it mean to sort of take the agency and the risk that can come with hearing and telling other stories? And I thought that was just such a fabulous question. I've been thinking about it a lot. And of course, I don't have a sort of grand answer, but there are two things that it made me think about. The first one is the way that Daniel 1 through 6 is very different from the other kind of literature that we're going to look at today, for example, which is very sort of cosmic and big idea in scope. So this is true in a lot of the Bible, right? We think about the stories of creation, apocalypse, right? This is about a reordering of creation and kind of grand plans of God. And there are big theological ideas and ideas about formal worship and things like that. But you also see these very personal stories, these very intimate interactions and relationships. And so I think when it comes to having the Bible lead the way on that, having on our own reflections of how we might bear the burden of risk, I think to look for those kinds of stories in the Bible as guidance, and that you can sort of tell a difference between the stories that are trying to sort of assert a big cosmic idea or theological kind of power, and the ones that give you these intimate close-up relationships. Of course, maybe we're really used to that from reading the Gospels. And of course, much of what Jesus is doing, right, is this intimate, in-person listening and relationality. But there's a lot of that in the Old Testament too. And it also had me thinking in my own life about how, in addition, of course, to interpersonal relationships, that reading and specifically reading fiction has helped me to hear voices and perspectives that I was not familiar with before. I'm a child of English teachers. And so I'm a big proponent of reading literature and reading widely. Because I think that there's something about fiction, that is able to give voice and to draw us in to another world and to foster empathy and listening. That is really important. So there are a lot of, I'm sure, strategies for change and for listening in terms of face-to-face interpersonal relationships to draw on. But I also just want to put in a plea for reading novels. And this is one thing that I really love about Westminster and the all church book read. A few years ago, I got to read it, to lead a discussion when Lila was Marilyn Robinson was the all church book read. And I just think that's a wonderful way to hear voices different from our own. So those are just some initial thoughts on that, but we can also come back to that question in our discussion at the end if you'd like. Okay, the Book of Ezekiel. So I said this is a dustier corner. I actually, as a rule, don't really like the Book of Ezekiel. It has a lot of problematic parts in it, and I want to just point that out from the get-go, that there are some metaphors of violence against women that are employed in particularly vulgar and egregious ways, especially in chapters 16 and 23 of the Book of Ezekiel. So I feel like we need to name that our relationship with Scripture is complicated, and there are things in there that we must say, that's not language that I want to repeat. That's not something I want to reinforce. Also in Ezekiel is this remarkable shift in Ezekiel's thinking from understanding God to be present and accessible primarily or even only in the temple in Jerusalem, and then watching the temple be destroyed and saying, where can I find God now? And Ezekiel was a priest and a prophet. And so he was very much sort of steeped in Zion theology that understood Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple as the chosen location for God to dwell. And so he was very much invested in the holiness of the temple and the way that the temple was the sort of center of God's dwelling in and covenant with Israel. But in 597, so before 10 years or so before the destruction of Jerusalem, Ezekiel himself is exiled in a kind of first wave of Babylonian deportations to Babylon. And so he does his prophesying that we find in the Book of Ezekiel from Babylon. And I'll never forget, one time I was checking out at the Walmart in Winchester, Tennessee. I was teaching at Swanee, which is up on a mountain, up on the Cumberland Plateau. And you have to come, it's a good 20, 25-minute drive to get groceries. And so I would bring with me insulated bags for the refrigerated stuff, hot Tennessee summer. And I was checking out one day, and the very nice cashier struck up a conversation, about, because I was asking to have the cold stuff put in the insulated bags, about where you live, what do you do, where you teach. And so I said that I teach Old Testament at the School of Theology at Swanee. And she said, oh, so about the UFOs in Ezekiel. And I had to sort of step back and think I did not know about the UFOs in Ezekiel, but I confess that I did not ask. I did just sort of move along, and it taught me maybe not to tell people that I teach Old Testament as the sort of first answer to that question. But I realized then, after going back and checking out Ezekiel, that it's because of the wheels in Ezekiel's vision, and the sort of the rotation and the flying that we see in Ezekiel's vision. So in the first chapter of Ezekiel, Ezekiel has a vision of this throne that's on wheels, that's surrounded by these animals. And it says that the spirit of the animals is in the wheels. And it says very clearly that the wheels, they can go in any direction without turning, without pivoting. It reminds me of a spinner suitcase. You know how you can move one of those spinner suitcases in any direction without having to twist it or turn it or wrestle it. And in Ezekiel's vision, God is sitting on this throne that is on wheels. And so the wheels become, of course, very important, because as Ezekiel works out, as the book goes along and the visions go along, God can move, right? God can leave the temple and be in any direction. God can go into Babylon. God can go elsewhere. Let me read you just a few verses from Ezekiel 1. Starting at verse 15. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the four of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl, and the four had the same form, their construction being something like a wheel within a wheel. So you can kind of get how you see, some of the traditional pictures of UFOs, how they have like the lights that spin and the round things. Anyway, I think that's where that's coming from. When they moved in any of the four directions without veering as they moved. The rims were tall and awesome, for the rims of all four were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved beside them. And when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Wherever the spirit would go, they went, and the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When they moved, the others moved. When they stopped, the others stopped. And when they rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. And so from this vehicle, or on this vehicle, eventually Ezekiel sees, verse 26, above the dome over their heads, there was something like a throne, in appearance like sapphire. And seated above the likeness of a throne was something that seemed like a human form. And then upward from the loins, I saw gleaming amber and something that looked like fire. And then like the bow in a cloud on a rainy day, such was the appearance of the splendor all around. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And I really like how Ezekiel is so, he repeated over and over, something like, it's something like. He's having this vision, and it is so wild. It is, and it's approximate, right? There's nothing that can actually describe it in the best language that he can find. He uses something like gleaming fire, something like, and it is then the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. So it is God, but it is, of course, in Old Testament tradition, you can't see God face to face or you will die. And so there's always this sort of approximation, right? This veil. So all of that is very interesting. And then God the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God takes Ezekiel on a tour through a journey using this vehicle. And it takes a tour of the temple in Jerusalem. And so if we're in like 597, 590, at this point, that temple is still standing, and shows Ezekiel all the sort of marks of idolatry that have been set up in the temple. And so for many, many chapters, 32 and a half chapters, Ezekiel, through many series of prophecies, talks about how something terrible is going to happen. It's all prophecies of judgment about how God's glory has already left the temple, and therefore, right, the temple is going to fall. But funny for Ezekiel, funny or not funny, but oddly enough for Ezekiel, at chapter 33, when he receives word in 586 BCE that the temple has been destroyed, this is actually really good news for him because he's been prophesying for years that it's going to come. And the coming disaster was always coming. And so once the disaster arrived, all of a sudden, Ezekiel is able to turn toward hope and to prophesy hope, because in his prophecies of disaster, he has seen that God is already out of the temple. God is already visiting him in Babylon. God is already able to move in any direction without veering. And so that fundamental idea that there is this way that one accesses God, and it has to do with priestly leadership, and it has to be in the temple, right? Ezekiel has a complete theological reappraisal of holy space. And so at this is the kind of pivot point in the whole narrative I've got on the screen here at Ezekiel 33, verses 21 through 22. In the 12th year of our exile, in the 10th month, on the 5th day of the month, someone who had escaped from Jerusalem came to me and said, "The city has fallen." Now the hand of the Lord had been upon me the evening before the fugitive came. But he had opened my mouth by the time the fugitive came to me in the morning. So my mouth was opened, and I was no longer unable to speak. And so there's this really symbolic opening of Ezekiel's mouth here. And so it's after this that we get the very famous Valley of the Dry Bones passage in Ezekiel, foot bone connected to the ankle bone and all of that. That vision is part of that vision of hope, right? After Ezekiel's mouth has been opened and after the destruction has come. And this bringing into dry bones, right? Death and destruction, the possibility of new life. And so then the book of Ezekiel ends with a tour of a new temple, a kind of ideal temple. But the tour of that temple does not seem to be then kind of the idea that a physical temple is going to be reestablished. I mean, that possibility is there, but there's also kind of the sense that it's simply a new way of understanding God in holy space, and that it doesn't have to be so fixed to a particular place and time. Now, I think we've been doing this, right, during COVID, a reappraisal of holy space and what it means, right, to be together. This is something that we've all been thrown into, how to worship God if we are apart, how to worship God if the sanctuary is inaccessible or unsafe or not there. So I think this is something that we continue to do today all the time. And for me, it's helpful to look back at the Old Testament and see that the Old Testament does not prescribe or describe one way of being in relationship with God, of worship, of engaging holy space. And so I think that this is where Ezekiel, for all of its many faults, is also a helpful resource for rethinking the life of faith together. I'm going to press on to my next point about Daniel and developing a new genre, but then at the end, hope to leave a little time for some questions or discussion about both Ezekiel and the second half of Daniel. So the third mode of innovation I see in the Old Testament is developing a new genre. And so this is related to adapting popular culture to rethinking storytelling, except instead of adapting something that existed, it is a pretty whole cloth innovation. Now, as the book of Ecclesiastes reminds us, there's nothing new under the sun. And so Apocalypse does have roots that we can see in prophecy, having a vision, that sort of thing, telling the future, bringing words from the divine to the human realm. But the way that it engages this kind of very colorful, we'll say, imagery and the use of monsters to talk about world politics, its kind of allegorical nature. The genre as a whole is quite distinctive, both from the prophecy that came before it and from anything else that was existing around this time. So Jewish scribes of the Second Temple period developed a new genre, the apocalypse, when Judaism was under grievous threat. So the apocalypse did not arise in times of prosperity or in times of great sort of peace and ease, but rather during times of persecution. The two full-fledged apocalypses in the Bible are Daniel 7 through 12 and Revelation, but there are lots of other early Jewish apocalypses attested outside the canon. First Enoch is a famous example from outside the canon. It has within it other apocalypses, the animal apocalypse, Book of the Watchers, and other little pieces. But when I say apocalypse, first of all, before we go any further, right, what do I mean? So we tend to think of the apocalypse as an event, right, the coming into the world. But when we're in the land of biblical studies, apocalypse is a genre of literature rather than an event. And you can see that in the book of Revelation, the sort of opening verses of Revelation, right, that it is an unveiling, the revelation to John. Apocalypse means this unveiling. And so its key characteristics are, first of all, that divine knowledge is revealed to a human intermediary. So there is messaging from the divine, often via an angel or other messenger, to a human who is to either hold on to this vision or proclaim this vision. But that in and of itself is not the complete definition of apocalypse. That knowledge is about then a transcendent reality in which supernatural forces shape humanity and a judgment is coming, either on the world or on the dead. And in that way, you can think about apocalypse as having both a vertical axis and a horizontal axis, if you like that kind of language, mathematical kind of language, that there is this revelation of knowledge from top to bottom, right, from divine to human. But there is also an idea that what's going on here vertically is also shaping the passage of time, the sort of human life, and that there is an eschaton, there's an end that is coming. Maybe that's a kind of judgment on the dead, has to do with the afterlife, or maybe it is simply the terminus of a particular era of world politics. So I said that the apocalypse really flourished in times of persecution. And when we're talking about Daniel 7 through 12, the persecution at hand is the persecutions of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So very quick, oversimplified history of ancient Israel after the exile in 586. Then that's to Babylon in Persia. Persia in 539 defeats Babylon, allows the exiles to return to Judah and to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. But then at that point, Judah is essentially a colony of Persia. And so then when Persia is conquered by Alexander the Great, then Alexander is in charge. And then, of course, he does not live very long, and his kingdom is divided among his generals, who then fight for control. And Antiochus is from the Seleucid line of generals and rulers. And the Persians and Alexander and even the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, so these kind of factions that appear after Alexander, for the most part, leave Jews alone to do their worship as long as they're paying temple taxes and that sort of thing. Like the temple also becomes then a locus for collecting tribute to the empire and that sort of thing. But there's a lot of sort of encroaching Hellenism, and within Judaism, a diversity of thought about how much essentially to capitulate to empire. I mean, the same kind of thing that you see on the interpersonal level in Daniel 1-6, right? How much do you give and where do you draw a line? But there's this sort of uneasy peace, I suppose, for a long time. But then, for a variety of reasons that historians kind of speculate about, Antiochus gets mad. And long story short, offers up the desolating sacrilege, offers up a sacrifice to Zeus in the temple, in the Jerusalem temple, and begins a period of persecutions. So of finding men and boys who are circumcised and killing them, torturing mothers who would have their sons circumcised. We read about some of these atrocities in the books of the Maccabees. So it's, we've been in the period of Hanukkah. Hanukkah celebrates the eventual victory of the Maccabees. But first, there are persecutions. And so, for example, he commanded his soldiers to cut down relentlessly everyone they met and to kill those who went into their houses. Then there was massacre of young and old, destruction of boys, women, and children, and slaughter of young girls and infants. The altar was covered with abominable offerings that were forbidden by the laws. People could neither keep the Sabbath nor observe the festivals of their ancestors, nor so much as confess themselves to be Jews. And so when we go to the apocalyptic literature of Daniel, then we are entering into literature that was speaking in some way to this time of great persecution. So for our example, we're going to look at Daniel 8. Let's see. I'll read just a little sampling of the beginning of Daniel 8. It's just a lot of descriptions of beasts and their horns and their eyes and that sort of thing. So I'm going to just give a kind of short overview of that, but then we'll come to where Daniel then interprets that vision, because I think that's the really interesting stuff. So before I go there, think of Daniel. So remember how Daniel is in the court of these successive kings, right? Babylon and Persia, and it's sort of different kings within that timeline. And so the idea is that Daniel, back then in the third year of King Belshazzar, is having this vision. But it's clear from what's written that it was written in the 2nd century, and Daniel was the character who stood in to have the vision in the literary construction of the book of Daniel as a whole. Okay, so he sees himself in Susa, the capital in the province of Elam. Susa was a Persian capital before the Greeks took over. I looked up and saw a ram standing beside the river. It had 2 horns. Both horns were long, but one was longer than the other. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward, and all beasts were powerless to withstand it. And then there was a goat with a horn between its eyes, and it came toward the ram, and with savage force, enraged against it, struck the ram, breaking the horns. And then out of the broken horn of the goat came another horn, a little one, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, the east, and toward the beautiful land. I heard a holy one speaking at verse 13 of Daniel 8. And another holy one said to the one that spoke, "For how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled?" And he answered him, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." And Gabriel then, Daniel does not understand the vision. So here's another kind of characteristic of apocalyptic literature, that the vision is one thing, but then it still requires interpretation. And so the angel Gabriel comes to Daniel and says, "Understand, O mortal, that the vision is for the time of the end." And so there's that where I want you to hear that distinction between kind of, we think of the apocalypse as the end of the world, but apocalypse is really more concerned with the periodization of time. And so it can be with the end of something, not necessarily the end of all things. And here is the interpretation that Daniel gives. And so what I would like you to listen for here is how this highly symbolic language about these goats and rams and stuff that seems so weird to us. It's very common for people to say it was some sort of code, so that, so-called hidden transcript, so that the powers that be could not catch them talking about it. But here Gabriel tells us what's going on. And even if Antiochus's name is not said, no one reading it would not understand that it was Antiochus. So I think there's something else going on besides this kind of coded language, or the coded language is not necessarily to stay hidden, but for something else. So here's the interpretation. This is in Daniel chapter 8, beginning at verse 18. "As he was speaking to me, I fell into a trance, face to the ground. Then he, Gabriel, touched me and set me on my feet. He said, 'Listen, and I will tell you what will take place later in the period of wrath, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between its eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power.'" And so there we can hear, right, Alexander and his kingdom is divided. Verse 23, "At the end of their rule, when the transgressions have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance shall arise, skilled in intrigue. He shall grow strong in power, shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does. He shall destroy the powerful and the people of the holy ones. By his cunning, he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind, he shall be great." Always like that line. "In his own mind, he shall be great. Without warning, he shall destroy many, and shall even rise up against the prince of princes. But he shall be broken, and not by human hands. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. As for you, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now." So notice there that Daniel is told, right, I'm telling you this when Babylon is in charge, but you should just hold on to this, seal it up, because it's about the future. "So I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I arose and went about the king's business, but I was dismayed by the vision and did not understand it." So one thing that is at work in this invention of this wild stuff. I know that at least in my Presbyterian churches over my lifetime, I have not heard a lot of engagement with the apocalyptic literature, even though in other traditions, of course, it's very common to talk about the apocalyptic sections of the Bible. And I think one thing it's doing is providing a vision for God's control when it seems that human rulers have a kind of absolute control, right? It's giving this kind of, again, cosmic level hope that there is an end to the particular suffering, and that there are plans afoot that we may not understand, but assert God's control over history. And again, this periodization is also very important, that nothing lasts forever except God. And so there was something about the persecutions of Antiochus, which I didn't even put up the most horrible passages from the books of the Maccabees. There was something that was so absolutely terrible, right? That there was not yet language for describing both that terror as well as God's place in that terror. And so the apocalypse arises as kind of giving a new vocabulary, new structures for trying to understand where God is in the midst of suffering. Anathea Portier-Young, who teaches at Duke, talks about, she has a wonderful book, if you're interested in apocalypse, called Apocalypse Against Empire. And she talks about how apocalypse disrupts the logic of terror, that it is able to kind of intervene in a, if the vision is simply that there's suffering and more suffering, and that terror has its own internal logic, and apocalypse interrupts it, which I really like. And so some questions that I would put to us here are, where do you see the logic of terror or the presence of monsters operating today? How can the church intervene on a large scale? And how can individual churches intervene on an everyday scale? What is it that, where is there a need for a newness, a new way of talking or being that can disrupt the logic of terror? One last thing I will say about apocalypse. I think I have the quotation right at my hands, but in the Women's Bible Commentary on Daniel, Carol Newsom points out that apocalypse has all these visions, but it does not provide a concept of what it means to feed and change a baby and grow food and work a job in a time of terror. That again, here, this points again to that difference between the kind of cosmic power of God, but then on the ground, what do you do every day to survive in the midst of empire? So that's not quite the question that apocalypse is answering in the way that the early chapters of Daniel, I think, do start to get at those questions. All right, so what questions or comments do you all have?
One of the things that came to mind for me, as everyone else is collecting their thoughts, is sort of in the context of the theme this year, which is about building beloved community. And maybe because I'm a writer and we talk a lot about being in conversation with other writers through different times, but it reminds me of how part of being in community together is thinking about who we're in conversation with theologically, the books that we're in conversation with, but also the interpreters of those books and the appliers, the practical theologians who tell us, what it looks like to apply scripture. And I'm wondering about, your hypothesis talks about building new genres and thinking about applying popular culture in different kinds of lenses. And the faith tradition I came from was often critical of new ways of applying lenses because there was some fear around that, or how far are we coming from what is the original? So I see that part of the hypothesis gives us permission to kind of, and encourages us to continue to look at new ways of looking at scripture, which seems really important for our ability to welcome voices that we have otherwise not yet heard from. So I'm wondering if you could comment at all on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. That rethinking theology and reinterpreting texts is a biblical idea, right? And that's essentially what I want to promote, that this is in fact biblical. It is faithful. It's what the Bible is already doing. The Bible is already in conversation with itself, other parts of itself. Rethinking when times change, how do we understand this tradition that we've inherited and are a part of, so that when Jesus comes on the scene and says, "You've heard it said, but I say to you," right? He is standing squarely in that tradition of Old Testament scriptures, Hebrew scriptures, and then early Judaism, which are constantly reinterpreting themselves. And so I think it's just really helpful to remember that the Bible is not like a rule book or a kind of set of encoded, despite what apocalyptic tends to do, a set of kind of coded messages for us that we just, if we get the right cipher, we can break the code and then figure it all out. But it is a conversation between stories with other genres, of course, as well, poems, laws. The Song of Songs is erotic love poetry. There's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament and in Scripture overall, and it is constantly thinking and rethinking about the texts that are contained within Scripture. And I think that very much gives us permission to continue rethinking those texts and putting them in conversation with new and emerging texts or ideas.
Thank you. Anyone else have anything bubbling up? Thoughts? All right. Thanks, Dwayne.
Again, thank you. I was struck by listening to that passage about what Antiochus does, and then comparing that with, I believe it's Daniel, who says he doesn't understand, even though the vision is true. Last week we were talking about courts and dreams. Apocalyptic visions are not dreams, are they? No. So my question is, does Antiochus know what he's doing? And is part of apocalyptic that we really, if we claim to, the old thing, if you claim to understand, you don't really understand. So well, how would you come back at that's something new?
Right. So does Antiochus know what he's doing, or is God controlling it all? Is that or what? Yeah, or what? Right. Well, so first of all, by the way, about the dreams and visions, you can kind of see how Daniel was a helpful figure in the tradition to be the one to receive the apocalyptic vision, because he already had a reputation for being a dream interpreter and for having visions. And so to sort of write up these apocalypses and have Daniel be the one to receive them, and it's just kind of makes sense in terms of the characters to draw on. But I think whether or not Antiochus, I think does, I don't know. At the end of the day, I suppose that Daniel is asserting that whatever Antiochus thinks he's doing, however great he thinks he is in his own mind, that God is greater still, and that God is in control still. And theologically, we would almost surely nuance this idea. And of course, this is what keeps seminary professors like me in jobs, right? Thinking and rethinking the ideas around free will and determinism and that sort of thing. But I think it shows that in that moment of terror, there was this cry for some sort of control that was outside, when it seems like the emperor had all the control in the world, that somebody else, something else was a power greater than the claim to absolute power that the emperor himself claimed.
Thank you. Yep. Tim, over.
Well, there's something afoot in the world that's monstrous, and it's not necessarily driven by an authoritarian ruler or any kind of ruler, and that's the pandemic, and it's affecting so many facets of human existence, and in some ways, it's even scarier because you can't focus on a single emperor and do whatever one is to do or ask for God's intervention. It's more amorphous and it's so unpredictable, and it's impacting almost every facet of our existence, from the economy through politics through health. I mean, when I think that 800,000 Americans have died, that's incredible. I mean, that's just incredible. But we don't know as a people yet how to control that or constrain it. And it just keeps re-emerging in such heinous ways. And it's almost, to me, scarier than if you had a rather horrible ruler doing awful things in a particular country or across countries. So I'm wondering, how does theology sort of make sense out of this kind of thing that it isn't necessarily human in nature, but it's having such a deleterious effect on we as people?
I think back to the work of my colleague now of blessed memory, Terence Fretheim, who did a lot of work on God. He's an Old Testament professor and did a lot of work on God and natural disasters. So, of course, he came to mind as I watched the devastation from the tornadoes yesterday, for example. And I think that the pandemic in its own way is a kind of prolonged natural disaster. And what he points out is that, God as creator created the world, and the world was around a long time before humans were on it. And there were hurricanes, and there were tornadoes, and there were floods, and there was weather. That we would not say that humans are the cause of natural disasters. However, we can see how humans make them worse. So not just in questions of climate change that are harder to pin down, but by, inequity in income and housing. That means that some people live in we saw this with Katrina, of course, in New Orleans, that some people, poorer people live in places more likely to be flooded and suffer disproportionately. We see this with the kind of lack of access to or distribution of vaccines in developing nations, that while there is nature all around us that does its thing, and we are in that, and part of it, human sin is not just in like that God is punishing us, but rather human sin we see in natural disasters in the way that there is inequity in suffering and an unwillingness to band together across difference, right, to help each other. So I think looking to those solutions that come down to, how do I love my neighbor in this way? And some of them are about providing aid through the Red Cross in the immediate aftermath. And some of them are about rethinking or dismantling systems that continue to perpetuate these kinds of inequities, right? There are short-term things to do, but there are also larger scale things to do as well.
We have time for maybe one more.
I'm thinking about your questions that you had up on there about the monsters today. So, I grew up in a family of faith, and I have a lot of nieces and nephews, big family, very smart people, late 20s, early 30s. And they're all good people, but they just think the church isn't relevant anymore to any of this because there's so many problems. They see the world that's environmentally disastrous. They see the inequities, the racism, all that. And they just don't think the church is relevant. And then you read in the newspaper, the studies say that now more than half of Americans don't identify with the church at all. So I just kind of wondering, I don't know the answers to your questions on the second. How can the church intervene, or how can churches intervene? Like, how do we say to people the church still is relevant and we can intervene in these things? And maybe there is no simple answer, but this is the people in the community that I live in, and the people I associate with, who think we're just kind of a dying breed here. So I don't know. Yeah. It's just a thought.
You have articulated what is the key question for the future of the church. And I will say just very briefly that in my own opinion, the church has got to be willing not to simply continue to try to preserve itself, but to be risk takers and to take stands for justice, not to worry about its buildings and not to worry about its endowments, but to be face forward as agents of change, because those needs will long outstrip the institutional church.
Thank you so much for being with us, Cameron, for bringing your knowledge to share with us so that we can also engage better in our own theology. I hope you have a Merry Christmas, and we look forward to learning from you again in the future.
Thanks, everybody.